Early stages, we are Youth with a Mission, and so we have something like 1,200 or more locations where YWAM teams are operational. We have tens of thousands of volunteers. We are a movement. We're not centrally coordinated or centrally directed. So early stages of anything like this, there's just hundreds and hundreds of teams wanting to come and people wanting to help. It's not just our locations, my goodness. We all have contacts with local churches, other organizations, governments, and so on. So initially, it's a bit like Genesis 1 and the chaos prior to the word of the Lord coming. So many great things start just like our world started in the Genesis account of chaos. And then God and his people began to bring order out of it. So that's kind of where we are. Lots of phone calls, lots and lots of emails, lots of trips and exploratory journeys into Poland and into Romania and so on. Delivery of a lot of goods already. But I've kind of stood back, thought about it, and thought, okay, we've got tyranny at work again here. So I want to talk about tyranny. Where does it come from? Why is the history of the world largely about the history of tyrants? That is, men, once in a while it's a woman. We'll come back to that probably. But it's 99.9% men who become powerful and impose their will on others. Why? Before I go any further on this subject, which I find fascinating, and I'm only going to be able to skirt over the surface of this, because the theology of where tyrannical power comes from is a really significant stream running right through scriptures, and I'm going to highlight a few things. But I just want to say again, as I always do, these are my thoughts. These are not official YWAM thoughts. They're available on my platforms. If they happen to be on a YWAM TV channel, a YouTube channel, or anything like that, then understand these are my thoughts. And there would be undoubtedly people who would question some of the things that I say. They'd see it slightly differently. I don't claim to be a scholar. What I claim to be is somebody who hears from God, reads the scriptures, take it seriously, because I think that while I really value the great Bible scholars, I think that God's truths are available to everybody, even the illiterate. Now, that's why oral Bible translation is so important, but that's another subject. So, what about this thing of tyrants? Why do they play such a prominent role? Because you can say that the way we learn history and the way we see history is a history of tyrants. You just think about the Bible story, and in many ways, the Bible narrative going back to written 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago, that's one of the most reliable, consistent, where you can really trace it right back, accounts of humanity, and it's tyranny all the way through. It's powerful people imposing their will on others. And when you get on through to the prophets and the kings of Israel, it becomes more and more obvious. But even prior to that, you think about, the history of Israel begins to become a history with being dominated by Pharaoh. And then they eventually get to the land that God promises, and they experience a combination of being attacked and displaced eventually by tyrants like Nebuchadnezzar or Ahasuerus or Xerxes. And they themselves had these tyrants. And as early as the first king with Saul, they had a tyrant. Then they had David, who, there were some things that he did that was just using coercive power, deadly power. But then you get to Solomon, and I was thinking about it today. Solomon, with all of his wisdom and all of his wealth and all the rest, he had the ingredients that go towards making up tyranny. And he became a tyrant, and where the people really wanted to be rid of him. And along came Jeroboam, and had a prophecy that he would have 10 of the tribes, and and then he became a tyrant and so on. What I was thinking about was what must it have been like to be in Jerusalem and to be a young man, in your late teens or early 20s or whatever. I don't know what age they used to get married then and find their life partner, but whatever age that was, and you'd just settle on the most beautiful girl you'd ever seen, in your opinion, and then Solomon would say, no, I'll have her. And you'd choose another one, and then before long, no, I'll have her too. And you end up marrying the fifth person on your list, which is not an auspicious start, because he had 1,000 women and girls at his command, reserved solely for him. Now that's tyranny. The Bible doesn't say a whole lot about it, just says that's the way it was. But you put yourself in that position and you're dealing with a tyrant. And in the end, his son lost the kingdom because he was overtaxing and doing exactly what Samuel the prophet said he would do, which is taking the girls to be his wives, to be his bakers, to be his cooks and so on, taking the boys to work in his army, and tyranny. And then in our time, you think about it, I think we're all very familiar with the tyranny of a Hitler. And when you think about that, that whole story demonstrates that history is written by the victors. So the Western Allies defeated Hitler and the Emperor of Japan, and so they are definitely the bad guys in history. We don't go very much into how that happened and the injustices that led to that, and the oppression of the German people by the others in Europe and so on, because we like that story that the bad guy got his just desserts. But of course, the circumstances that make us think about that today is that we have a man in the Kremlin who was president and then prime minister and then president and so on, and he's basically been in power for 22, 23 years now. And in these days, he's very much acting like a tyrant. So it made me think, what leads to a tyrant who will invade another country, bomb hospitals and theaters where children and mothers are sheltering? What leads to that? And friends, it's really important to remember that the Western nations invaded Iraq and battled in Syria and Afghanistan, and many women and children were killed there. And we really want to see the world in terms of good guys and bad guys, but it's never quite like that. Even now, without going into history and stuff, and the division within the Orthodox Church and the nationalism and all, this is not just a picture of good and evil. But there's no doubt that what the Russian military is doing now is evil. Why? What does the Bible have to say about that? What does the story of God recorded in Scripture have to say about that? Well, I want to contrast that story of tyranny with the way God wanted his people to be governed. So let's think back a little bit first to the pre-kingship time of Israel and think about how they were organized and what God was doing in them and through them at that time, because they came out from under a hierarchy with one man at the top, the Pharaoh. And when there's one man at the top like that and it's a successive ruler from the same family, you inevitably get somebody underneath who's the real power. So you had a Pharaoh, and you had a time back earlier when Joseph became the man of real power, but eventually a Pharaoh came along who didn't know the Jews and became a tyrant, and they were set free. How were they organized? When God met with them at Sinai, how were they organized? Well, they stayed in tribes, 12 of them, and they stayed in clans. So there were all kinds of families, and there was a patriarch, a leading person in charge of a particular clan, and then the clans formed together, and into tribes. But who was the leader? They didn't have a king. As we'll go forward, we see that they weren't meant to have a king. So how did it work? Well, there was Moses. It's clear that he was a deliverer, and that's how he came to rule. And then there was Joshua, and God was clearly with him, and that's how he ruled. And then it went on into a series of judges and prophets and deliverers. We know of Gideon and Jephthah, and we know of Samson, and on down through until you get to Eli and then Samuel. Those are fascinating books. And sometimes we draw rather superficial conclusions about them. But what you can say is that for a long time, they did not have any kind of kingdom or empire. They were not a people who were ruled by a family with an ongoing ruling authority where the eldest son took the place of the eldest son, and so on. And what they had was a continuation of the tribes and the patriarchs and the clans. In other words, it was a distribution of power. And I think at the heart of tyranny is any kind of governmental system which allows for the centralization of power. As long as it's dispersed, then you don't get as much tyranny. Many people look at the last few chapters of the book of Judges, and especially where you get this horrific scene of every man doing what's right in their own eyes. And it was awful, and there were some terrible things happening there, but when compared to a ruler who seeks to eradicate their neighbors, the suffering was not as great, because there was not as much power to misuse. But when you get to Samuel, and Samuel comes to the end of his life, then Israel is saying, we would rather have a king than this whole process of trying to see who's anointed as judge, because Samuel, you're about to die. Your sons aren't like you. They don't have that same integrity. We don't really trust them. They can't ride on your coattails. We want a king. And Samuel says, in essence, if you set up a governmental process where there's a sequence of rulers from a family, you will have tyranny. He said, he's going to take your daughters to be in his household and be his cooks and so on. He's going to take your sons to run before his chariot and be in his army. And he's going to tax you. He's going to oppress you. And they said, nevertheless, we would like a king. And of course, as I said, that came true. And by the way, in that sequence of kings, you have various ones who were very wicked, and then ones who were reforming kings. And in the middle of it all, you have Athaliah. You have the queen mother who managed to come to ascendancy and then killed all the other members of the royal family. All right down to the babies. I mean, what kind of woman was that? Those are very rare, but it does demonstrate that it can be done by a woman too. It's just rare. But they had a sequence of those, and then other tyrants would come against them. Why this tyranny? When for all of us as human beings, we know that if we will just be kind, thoughtful, gentle, loving, then we can live a peaceful life. What is it? Well, that goes back to the Genesis story again. Not only was there order coming out of chaos in the Genesis story, there was also then the intrusion of evil, symbolized by the serpent. And what's he saying? You can have more power. You want more power? Is it good for you to have to do what God says? Because God is just trying to protect his power, You can also be like God. You can have the knowledge of what is good and what is evil. You can experience a much wider range of things, and you can be independent. And of course they fell for that. And then starts this sequence of tyrants. So why does it have that characteristic? I think it's because of something that we learn sort of indirectly in the Old Testament. years ago, thinking and praying about this, and we were praying a lot for London and fasting and praying and engaging in some large prayer events, and they sort of snowballed and gained momentum until we had March for Jesus, and that went international to, I think 170 nations, if I remember correctly. And 12 million people on a day praying over their cities and all. It was great, but as we were praying for London, we had this sense, London had been and still is the most consistently prominent financial capital of the world for the last 800 years. It's not always the top, but it's always in there towards the top, and at times it's top again. And so we were praying for London, and this was in 1980, 81, 82, and God spoke to us that there was a demonic power, a manifestation of the kingdom of darkness, and its name was greed and unrighteous trade. Now that's not real profound, but it was quite profound at the time. It was quite a revelation, and that guided our prayers for a long time, still does in many respects, for London, and that would be true of other major economic capitals. And one of the ways that was confirmed to us is, I can't remember exactly how, but the scriptures out of Ezekiel came alive to me, maybe as others too. But Ezekiel in 26, 27, 28 is prophesying. Does it go into 29? No, it's through 28. He's prophesying against Tyre. Now, what was Tyre? Well, that was the economic capital of the known world at the time. Now, when I say known world, I mean known to the writers of the New Testament, or the Old Testament. There were things going on in the Far East with the Chinese and Japanese empires that were also power centers. But here we're talking about Phoenicia, the Phoenicians, and the wealthiest economic centers of the world at the time. And he's prophesying. And this is what stood out to me. If we look at 28 at the beginning, so he's already had a couple of chapters of prophecies against Tyre, and basically saying, you think you're at the top of the world, and you're going to be brought down. But he starts 28 by saying, Son of man, say to the ruler of Tyre. And there's this prophecy against him about, you think you are really something else, but you're not. And in verse, is it 2? Yeah. In verse 2 of that prophecy in chapter 28, it says, in the pride of your heart you say, I'm a god. I sit on the throne of a god in the heart of the seas. That's quite significant because Tyre was at the end of a causeway, a road out, built up road that they had undoubtedly built with slave labor out to a small island, and that was the fortress of Tyre, very, very wealthy. And it says, you say I'm a god, but you are a man and not a god, though you think you are as wise as a god. So it's quite clear. This is the ruler of Tyre. But a little less than halfway through that chapter, it changes. Prophecy continues, but the subject of the prophecy changes, because then it says in verse 11, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, take up a lament concerning the king of Tyre, not the ruler, the king of Tyre, and say to him, this is what the sovereign Lord says. You were the model of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Wow, that's not a man. That's an angel. It goes on and describes him as being beautiful and adorned or embellished with ruby and topaz and emerald and chrysolite and onyx and jasper and sapphire and turquoise and beryl and so on. your settings and even the mountings of all these things were made of gold. And the day that you were created, they were prepared. So there's something about when the wealth of the earth was created, then there was this angelic being, and it said, you were in the holy mount of God, you walked among the fiery stones, you were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till wickedness was found in you. Now that's really interesting, because it means that there was a being who was unbelievably powerful and beautiful, and it goes on to say that he was responsible for trade and for the economic dealings. So it's really interesting. But it says he was blameless, he was created well, but wickedness was found in him. There's something I think it's complicated here where this is not God creating evil. This is not God creating an evil being. This is God creating an angelic being who, like us, has a measure of self-determination, that is choice, volition, will. And he makes his choices. And he turns to pride and arrogance and tries to exalt himself to, you were blameless in your ways. Through your widespread trade, you were filled with violence and you sinned. So I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God and I expelled you. Your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you to the earth. It goes on to say, you thought you could be equal with God, but you're not. Now it seems to me that that's the origin of evil, and it seems to me that that's what the serpent represents in the Garden of Eden. And you might want to say, you could conclude, I'll give you that I'm not saying something here that is established as a fact. What I'm saying here is this is the way I understand these scriptures. Others will understand them differently, but to me this makes sense. I'm not alone in coming up with these things, but it makes sense that you've got an angelic being who falls, and then he seemed to have had authority over the earth, and then you might say that God created us in his image to take the dominion back and to steward his beautiful creation of this earth. C.S. Lewis had a real insight into that. He never says it explicitly, but his whole series, the Space Trilogy, is really about that there would be some places, he said Venus and Mars, but it could be anywhere else in his universe where there are creatures, beings created in his image who have not fallen. And they haven't followed the way of this world. That actually Lucifer, if that's the name, but this demonic being had authority over this earth, but nowhere else. So this earth is uniquely wicked. But our job, as commissioned by God in the Garden of Eden, is to take dominion. Take back this earth. And so there's always a fight against tyranny. And from the time that Adam and Eve sinned, they aligned themselves and actually came under the powers of darkness, the tyranny. And ever since then, we have been liable to tyranny. And the primary, both the bait and the currency of tyranny is mammon. So when Jesus says, in I think it's Matthew 6, that you can't serve God and mammon, he's doing something like a dualism there, that you can serve God or you can serve mammon. He's not saying mammon is equal to God, but he's saying these are the choices. Well, how does that work? Why does he say mammon? And then elsewhere in the epistles, Paul writes that mammon is the root of all sorts of evil. And some translations say all evil. So what's that about? Well, I think that this Lucifer, this power of darkness, has a primary weapon or tool that he uses. It's a bait to us, and it's a magnetic attraction that money, mammon, constitutes something concrete that represents power. Do you ever feel that? Have you ever been in the place where you have more money than usual, and if you stop and think about how you're feeling a little more powerful? Not a good thought. Not a good thought. But one of the things that there are almost no exceptions to is that when a man, occasionally a woman, is lusting after power, they go for it through money. And even if you're not lusting after power, when you do get money, that feeling of being a bit more empowered is actually a feeling of independence from God, just like in the garden. And it's generally known that it's a rare person of great wealth who's also kind, generous, thoughtful, humble. No, not usually. Usually when they get more and more money, they become more and more difficult. And that's where tyranny comes from. It comes from that selling out to the quest for power. And tyranny is simply what we get when someone is particularly successful in that quest. You can't really mess with the currency of power without also subjugating yourself to the source of that power, which is that fallen creature. And that's where our tyranny comes from. So you not only have a Hitler, but even, a great list of them before that, Genghis Khan, the different popes, Pope Urban II, very, very powerful and wicked popes, the Medicis, because sometimes, they combine religious authority too, and then it's really awful. You have inquisitions and all. But even since World War II, you think about it, and we've had nothing quite as pervasive as Hitler was, but we've had the Saddam Husseins, we've had the Pol Pots, killed, it's estimated, a third of the entire population of Cambodia. We've had Mao Zedong, who was the biggest murderer of all times. I think it's estimated that his decisions led to the deaths of about 60 million people. Some say 40, but it was a lot. And then there was Stalin. And now, you've got the Uyghurs who, not just the Uyghurs, but the minority tribes, the Tibetans, but now especially the Uyghurs are more numerous in the west of China, who are being persecuted and murdered at a horrific rate. It's a much greater disaster in terms of human deaths than this awful situation in the Ukraine is. But it doesn't touch us as much. I've thought a little bit about, I'm running out of time here, but I've thought a little bit about why has the war in the Ukraine hit our papers so hard? Do you think we've been through some pretty awful stuff in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria before this? They all struck us strongly, but nothing as much as Ukraine. When I say us, I mean those of you watching who are part of the Western democratic nations. And I guess the reason is we always identify with people who are more like us than people who aren't. Now, that's not racism. It can be. It can tip over into it. But it hits closer to home when the people who are suffering are from a culture more like ours, from a government and a nation more like ours, and who in their general structure and culture are more similar to ours. Because there's something in us that's not even conscious, but it's a subconscious thing. Then it could happen to me. And that's true. That's true. So what do we do in light of this? We pray for the kingdom to come. We pray for the eventual end of all this. But in the meantime, we do intercede. We pray. We wrestle not against principalities, against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. There's something going on in the heavenlies that energizes all this. And we try to stand up for righteousness. And we do our best to understand the complexities of these things. Even in the Ukraine, it's not as simple as good and evil. There are really good people in Russia. Lovely people. There are some bad people in Ukraine. So it's not just a good against evil. There's no doubt that the preponderance of evil is, in this case, with the invaders trying to take over a nation that does not want to be occupied. But this is yet another chapter in the story of tyranny. And I think for us, it's important that we not exercise any tyrannical power in our families, in our churches, in Youth with a Mission. And I don't have time to go into it at all, but one of the reasons why we have moved away from directors of this and directors of that is because even those were relatively powerless positions, because you didn't handle people's money normally. You didn't have much wealth yourself normally. You didn't have the currency of tyranny. Nevertheless, titles, positions can lead to the abuse of authority and attempts to manipulate and dominate other people. And God said no to that back in 1 Samuel 1-8, when he said, you don't want a king. They had it anyway. And then with the church, from the day of Pentecost, you had the apostles, and they were accountable one to another. There was no single person in charge, even though some parts of the church read it that way. You can't really read it that way. It doesn't make sense. Because God was once again dispersing power to limit the risk of tyranny. And wherever we create a position that has some power in it, sooner or later, somebody will seek it out of their own self-interest and selfish ambition. And as James writes, then you have every evil thing. So I think that's a little bit about, at least my thinking about where tyranny comes from and why. And I hope that if that resonates with you, then you will take the battle to prayer and then obedience to God. And do your best to obey him. If he tells you to alleviate suffering by going or whatever he asks you to do that. We're called to do as the early church did. Go to the poor, the needy, those in prison, those hurting, the orphans, the widows, and alleviate suffering, because that's the primary antidote to tyranny. Amen. May the Lord deliver us from tyranny in our time. Thanks for watching or listening.